it has never been found. But the Apollo program continued, and so did the string of untimely deaths. Between 1964 and 1967, a total of 10 astronauts lost their lives in freak accidents. These deaths accounted for an astonishing 15% of NASA's astronaut corps.
To keep something that's alive wrapped up and covered over, you've got to eliminate all the people that can talk about it.
Could the government have gone this far to pull off such an elaborate hoax? NASA says it's impossible.
There were probably 250,000 people who were directly involved in the Apollo program, and another 500,000 people beyond that. 750,000 people can't keep a secret like that. That's just not going to happen.
But Bart Sibrel insists that most NASA employees knew nothing of the deception.
Very few people at NASA knew. The thing is so departmentalized. You got the person building the bolts in Houston, or doing this in Seattle, or doing this in Florida. No one knows the full picture. So, you had no one seeing the full picture of anything except a handful of people.
If the conspiracy theorists are right, and only a few people knew the whole story, then the truth may remain buried forever. Some say the astronauts could never even have survived the trip.
The reason why they couldn't go to the moon is because of a phenomenon that few people know about called the Van Allen radiation belts.
500 miles above the Earth, these bands of intense radiation surround our planet and are thousands of miles thick.
Any human being traveling through the Van Allen belt would have been rendered either extremely ill or actually killed by the radiation within a short time thereafter.
Other than the Apollo missions, no other manned space flight has attempted to pass through this deadly radiation.
Every manned mission in history, Gemini, Mercury, Skylab, the Space Shuttle, has been below the radiation belt, all except going to the moon.
To protect the astronauts, the capsule would have needed 6 feet of lead shielding, according to physicist Ralph Rene.
Obviously, the only shielding they had was the literally paper-thin outer hull of aluminum, and their suits consisting of glass fiber, some aluminum fibers, and silicon rubber.
It's very interesting concerning radiation that the astronauts were protected by a thin film of aluminum, when here on Earth they put a lead shield on us when they take a dental x-ray.
Some theorize that if the Van Allen belts didn't kill the astronauts, even deadlier doses of radiation deeper in space would have. Violent explosions in the sun called magnetic storms flood space with intense radioactivity.
A magnetic storm will come along, and that can increase the intensity of the radiation belts by maybe 1,000 times above what it was before.
According to Rene, the Apollo 16 mission coincided with one of the sun's most intense storms ever recorded.
Around the rotating sun came this immense flare, the biggest one of the 20th century. It went on for 3 or 4 days. All the while it's slowly rotating around.
Although the effects of radiation are horrific, ranging from hair loss to cancer to death, the solar flares had no adverse effect on the Apollo 16 crew.
NASA had another problem, and one is that the moon's surface is totally inhospitable to man. You do it in the dark, and that includes any part of the shadow of the spacecraft itself. The temperatures go down to 250 degrees below zero. In the sun, the temperatures go up to 250 degrees above zero.
Rene also theorizes that the astronauts' liquid-cooled spacesuits could not have provided sufficient protection from the intense heat and radiation. But NASA maintains that this hypothesis is wrong.
The claim that the radiation on the lunar surface would have incapacitated or hurt the astronauts, it's equal parts bad science and a bad understanding of how we went about designing the equipment. The spacesuits that they wore were incredibly tough and very resilient to lots of different things.
If those suits do what NASA says they can do, then I want to see them suit up a guy or two, put him into 3 Mile Island, the pit there that's still hot, and have them clean up the mess. But they can't and they don't.
The fact remains that no Apollo astronaut has ever suffered a serious illness from a trip to the moon. Could this be because they never left the safety of Earth's atmosphere in the first place?
This is the main reason why the Russians never really intended to send the men to the moon.
Was it the fear of lethal radiation that caused the Russians to abandon their plans to go to the moon? According to one of their chief cosmonauts, it was certainly a factor.
Of course, we were worried to go out into the unknown of space. Of course, we were fearful. We had no idea how a human would be affected by the radiation. We suspected that possibly the radiation could even penetrate through the craft itself.
Are the deadly perils of space proof that NASA faked the Apollo missions? To this day, the Russians have never sent a man to the moon. And we have no plans to return. Now that you have heard the various theories and explanations, do you believe it's possible for our government to perpetrate such an incredible hoax? Is it conceivable that with its $40 billion price tag, the Apollo program was nothing more than the most expensive movie ever made?
It is my personal belief, and I totally believe this after all the years of research I've done on this, that NASA never landed a man on the moon.
I would say that anybody who believes that we did not go to the moon is an absolute nut.
Anyone that wants to call me a kook or a nut or a crackpot, they're welcome to do that, but they're also welcome to go examine the evidence, which is everywhere.
Bottom line, the United States went to the moon in the 1960s and the 1970s. End of story.
Is there any way to put this controversy to rest once and for all? The only thing the experts agree upon is that the answer is 250,000 miles away. If NASA truly landed on the moon, remnants of the 6 successful Apollo missions would have been left behind. The base structures of the LEMs, the abandoned lunar rovers. Even the American flags would still be standing at each landing site.
I would like to invite NASA and all of their supporters to simply take the most powerful telescope on Earth and see if there's a lunar lander there. If there's a lunar lander there, I'll never say another word about an Apollo hoax. If there's no lunar lander there, I'll rest my case.
But no telescope exists that can examine the moon in such detail. Do objects from the Apollo missions remain on the moon in silent testimony? Or is the conspiracy theory true? In 2 years, Japan will send an orbiter to take close-up photos of the moon's surface. What will they find? Until then, the question remains, did we land on the moon?
Next Sunday sees the start of a new series which takes each letter in the alphabet as a starting point to examine a range of phenomena which have yet.
It remains one of the greatest conspiracy theories of all time, born in an era of global political suspicion. Did the Apollo astronauts really land on the moon?
They had to fake the moon landings because they knew successful trips to the moon and returns could not be made.
They were producing a production, a showpiece, if you will.
Those close to the missions have nothing but contempt for the skeptics.
Their ignorance of science is so complete that it's pointless to try and argue with them.
These hoax
conspiracy propagators are doing a tremendous disservice to the young people of our future.
Any idea could have been hoaxed is, quite frankly, insane.
To test the evidence underpinning the hoax theories, we've built our own moon set. Were the Apollo moon landings really a giant leap for mankind as claimed, or just a small step for man? In the 21st century, one of our greatest achievements continues to fuel controversy.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
But were the Apollo moon landings the culmination of a carefully orchestrated hoax? Bill Kaysing is often called the father of moon conspiracy theorists.
When Armstrong said that's one small step for man and one giant leap for mankind, I think that the footprint that he was leaving was in Area 51, north of Las Vegas, Nevada.
The second man on the moon, close behind Armstrong, was Edwin Buzz Aldrin.
I'm totally in favor of freedom of speech. But I think people need to be responsible when they think about intentionally, for their own benefit, misleading the young people who are the future leaders of our world.
Though the hardcore of dedicated conspiracy theorists is small, their ideas have, over the past 3 decades, found a wide and appreciative audience. 1 in 5 Americans are believed now to entertain doubts.
And you hear about the fact that the landing was actually done in a television studio.
And there was the big black background with, like, you know, fake stars and stuff. It's the flag being planted on the moon facing one way and the shadow of the man being the other way.
I mean, I've heard that maybe the terrain that was seen on the video wasn't accurate, the walking wasn't accurate.
There are no stars in some of the photographs, and that there should be because there was no atmosphere and that the stars would shine so brightly.
If the Apollo missions were faked, NASA would have created a conspiracy of monumental proportions. 40 years ago, the Cold War locked the USA in an ideological struggle with the Soviet Union. On October the 4th, 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the world's first satellite. It was a coup for communism. The breakthrough hit America right where it hurt, in the heart of high technology.
Sputnik shocked a lot of people in this country, and I think the president was looking for a way to respond to this, and at the advice of a number of people, he chose an objective that he felt for sure we could be first.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
At the peak of the Apollo program, NASA employed 400,000 people. If the moon landings were faked, thousands of scientists and technicians were either duped along with the rest of us, or they've been extraordinarily good at keeping a secret all these years.
It was a giant step for mankind. We moved from people dreaming about whether people could get into space, and we went ahead in a very short time, so it was a very momentous achievement.
July the 16th, 1969, the astronauts prepare for takeoff. While the world waited for history to be made, there was already one man who had his doubts. During the 1960s, Bill Kaysing was head of technical publications for Rocketdyne, a company involved in the manufacture of the Apollo rockets. This gave him access to top-secret documents. What he read led him to question the feasibility of the whole moon project. He claims the CIA had made 3 attempts on his life to silence his controversial views. Today, he keeps a low profile, living on a cat sanctuary in the Nevada desert.
I really believe that they weren't in the command capsule at launch. They did a little bit of a magician act with the astronauts. They went up the elevator, but they came down the elevator. In other words, they did not want to risk the lives of the astronauts in case the Saturn blew up.
Like Bill Kaysing, Ralph Rene, a self-taught engineer and author, believes that the technology of the day simply wasn't up to the task.
There is absolutely no way they went to the moon with what they had. In fact, there's no way they can go today. There's no way they can go tomorrow. You don't send man where you haven't sent the monkey.
Nevertheless, the president had promised a man on the moon by 1970. If NASA couldn't do it, they'd have to fake it, with foolproof documentary evidence. Marcus Allen is the British publisher of Nexus, a magazine dedicated to alternative politics, history, and science.
Those photographs can be demonstrated not to have been taken on the lunar surface. Now, if they were not taken on the lunar surface, there's only one other place they could have been taken, and that's on Earth.
Documentary evidence from all 6 of the successful Apollo landings shows similar anomalies. In some, areas lit from behind, which should be in deep shadow, are bright and perfectly visible. In other pictures, the shadows are at near right angles, suggesting 2 separate light sources. Perhaps most surprisingly, there are no stars in the Apollo photographs, even though they were taken from space. When the archive film is sped up, the astronauts appear to be running at normal speed in terrestrial gravity. And why does the flag appear to be fluttering in a breeze, even though there's no wind on the moon? To test whether any of these allegations can be substantiated, we plan to create our own lunar set. Its location, the Trona Pinnacles, a desert area 4 hours from Hollywood, home of Illusion. Our moon set will be used as a backdrop, not to try and fake our own lunar landings, but to test the most famous hoax theories. We've brought in historically accurate props to recreate the iconic moments. A single high-wattage studio lamp will replicate the intensity of the sun as our sole light source. By challenging some of the most famous conspiracy arguments, can our experiments prove whether the small step for mankind was really the giant leap they said it was?
On y va! Yeah.
Don't you hate it when that happens?
We need some help?
You gotta say my name 3 times. Beetlejuice!
Don't even say it. Beetlejuice?
Beetlejuice!
Beetlejuice.
It's showtime. Beetlejuice, coming alive tomorrow at 8 on 5. Oh yeah.
In 1969, the general public had little reason. The stars and stripes planted by the Apollo astronauts provide the conspiracy theorists with what they believe is a trump card.
What I see is a flutter which is caused by variable wind pressures. So the picture could not have been taken on the moon no matter what the apologists say. Either that or the moon has a breeze.
Despite their preparations on Earth, neither Neil Armstrong nor Buzz Aldrin quite knew what to expect as they prepared to raise the flag.
Putting the flag on the moon was really a symbolic highlight of the mission. It was one that we had not really rehearsed. Neil knew where the flag was stowed. We brought it out, then we had to put the 2 pieces together.
It won't go up. Fade that end up.
The astronauts had to drive the flagstaff into the hard lunar surface with a twisting motion. A horizontal aluminium rod kept the flag suspended.
And this caused the free end of the flag to flip up and back in response to that. Also, this is an aluminum tube, very similar to the ones used on the Apollo mission. It's very springy. If I cause it to spring and then let go of it, we see that this motion continues long after I've let go of it.
On Earth, this pendulum motion would be damped, in engineering terms, by air resistance. But on the moon, there is no air to slow the flag down and stop it waving.
Most obvious evidence the flag was on the moon and not in any air is that whenever people walked by it, it didn't move at all. It only moved when someone was working with the staff or letting go as it rocked back and forth. It didn't billow like it was being hit by a burst of air. It swung back and forth like maybe a sheet of chainmail would. Try it yourself. Try this at home.
But decreased gravity and the lack of atmosphere can't provide an explanation for the next apparent blunder. When the 16-ton Eagle touched down, it should, claim the skeptics, have disturbed the surface of the moon, blowing the top layer of dust away to expose the rock beneath. But the images show footprints clearly imprinted around the base of the spacecraft. Surely the dust would have blown away, or worse.
This enormously powerful jet of flame and heat and gas, it would have easily scooped up an enormous crater. In fact, there was supposition that the crater would have been so big that the lunar lander would have disappeared into it. That's true.
Ralph Rene has designed a simple experiment to illustrate the point. He's calculated that the landing module would have been approximately 26 times more powerful than a domestic leaf blower. And if a humble leaf blower can leave a crater in a gravel pit, the module with 10,000 pounds of thrust should have made a canyon.
They didn't move dry dust, they didn't move little rocks, they didn't move anything. So the demonstration is to show that this stuff will disappear immediately, and I'll even be able to gouge some kind of a hole. Come here, you. I haven't used you in a long time. Here we go.
According to Ralph Rene's experiment, the moon, like the gravel pit, wouldn't have stood a chance.
When it actually landed, the dust was all still there. Now, how can that be? You know, if you blow dust away, it goes away, like I just did here. I swept the ground.
But the Eagle had reduced its power to 25% as it glided into land. Its gentle forward motion would have limited its impact on the ground even more. Under closer inspection, some of the photos do reveal that the landing disturbed the fine lunar soil, but not enough to blow away all surrounding dust. But the most intriguing anomaly has to be the absence of the largest, most stunning object seen in space. In a sky untouched by streetlights, atmosphere, or pollution, the view of the night sky should be spectacular. But incredibly, stars appear to be missing from the Apollo photographs.
Back then, fortunately for me and us, who are trying to break this thing out the truth, they took no pictures of the stars.
Bill Kaysing believes that omitting the stars was all part of NASA's deception.
Astronomers could have easily discerned that the star positions were not those that would have appeared in a photograph taken from the moon. So it's another case where they could not fake it, so they simply ignored it. If you were to talk to Aldrin or Armstrong or any of the other Apollo astronauts, they would actually not respond in any way to questions regarding stars.
When you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics.
I asked Neil Armstrong whether he saw stars because I knew everybody else would ask it. I knew the answer, of course. The point is that the eyes aren't adapted to that.
The human eye reacts to light by closing and opening the iris. In bright light, the iris becomes smaller. In the dark, it widens. On the moon, the eye, like a camera aperture, cannot adjust to the brightness of the lunar surface and the dim light of a twinkling star at the same time.
If you were to stand in a floodlit stadium or under a streetlight in a city, you would have the same effect. If you looked up, you wouldn't see many stars at all.
Even a modern state-of-the-art TV camera can't cope with such extreme contrast. On our moon set, Jay Windley plans to put the whole matter to an exhaustive test and dispute the theory once and for all.
We're going to find out that if we use an identical camera loaded with identical film and we shoot pictures of the night sky, we won't get stars. Okay, I'm going to take a shot here. You'll notice here I'm not using any sort of a viewfinder. I'm just aiming.
With a replica Apollo Hasselblad, Jay took more than 24 photographs and repeated the experiment using a range of other cameras to test the hoax theories. The morning after, the negatives were developed at an independent processing laboratory in Los Angeles.
In our experiment in the desert, we shot a variety of photographs using different film formats. In this 35mm photograph, we see that the shadows of the crew members in our single light source very distinctly converge together. In fact, there's almost a 90-degree difference in the apparent shadow direction. In this photograph here, we see the effects of terrain on the shadows. The hills change the apparent direction of shadows. The astronaut's shadow here falls in one direction. The shadow of the crew falls in yet another direction because of the hill.
These results directly contradict the conspiracy claims.
Like the Apollo astronauts, we had to guess at our focusing distances and our exposure settings. And because we had no viewfinder, we had to guess at the direction the camera was pointing. And you can clearly see that even with those handicaps, we were able to take quite usable photographs. You can immediately see that there are no stars in this photograph, even though the stars were very bright during our experiment. They're simply too dim to be registered on film at the exposure levels that we used to take these photographs.
The evidence appears to be overwhelming. But still, the skeptics refuse to lie down and roll over. A mysterious rock in a notorious Apollo 16 photograph has only added fuel to the fire.
It's a rock that obviously was made out of paper mache, and very clearly on the rock is the letter C.
Ralph Rene believes the C rock was probably the C prop.
Somebody told me that in Hollywood, when they do a set, the set manager comes around and drops cards on the ground, and it says A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, or 1 to 10 or whatever. And the prop men, whatever you call these people, they come out and they put that particular prop over the card. But in Hollywood, they're smart enough to turn the thing upside down so you can't see the mark on the prop.
NASA simply claims that this photo was a freak accident, that the C is in fact a hair on the negative.
And I think it's gonna be a long, long time till touchdown brings me round again to...
But this nitpicking over photographs is irrelevant for magazine publisher Marcus Allen. He's convinced that no photographic film could possibly have survived the journey to the moon and back in the first place.
In an unprotected camera, in unprotected environment, and the films that were in photographs we have seen as a result of that, it demonstrate absolutely no radiation damage whatsoever.
In 1998, IMAX began production on a film about the construction of the International Space Station.
They flew the cameras up in the space shuttle with their magazines attached, and the IMAX cameras take 70mm roll film, incidentally the same film as was used in the Hasselblad still cameras on Apollo. This film had to be protected, and it was carried up in lead-lined boxes.
Radiation may be the final insurmountable obstacle. Not only would it apparently destroy film, it would also kill the astronauts. The Earth's magnetic field shields our planet from high doses of radiation. But beyond this, in space, the conspiracy theorists claim the astronauts' fragile flesh would be bombarded by an arsenal of deadly forces.
The moon is irradiated by the sun constantly with terrible heat, and of course there's cosmic radiation, and then there are micrometeorites that travel 60,000 miles an hour that would go right through the camera, the film, and of course the astronauts themselves.
While the odds against a micrometeoroid hitting an astronaut are believed to be extremely low, any puncture would be decidedly uncomfortable.
Not only that, on leaving the Earth's atmosphere, the astronauts had to negotiate the Van Allen belts.
Van Allen, he said it was a sea of deadly radiation. You would pick up a death dose just about the time you got through the Van Allen shield. You'd be cooked and you'd be dying.
These radioactive belts form a thick invisible ring around the Earth's equator, thinning out around the North and South poles.
Until they get an engine that'll lift the life capsule surrounded by 6 feet of water or equivalent mass of lead, they don't even dare go through the Van Allen shield.
In fact, Dr. Van Allen, who's still alive, makes no secret of the fact that he thinks these stories about killer radiation are silly. Entertaining but preposterous is his words. And the reason is that the radiation levels there are not enough to hurt you unless you stay there for a long time. Van Allen says about a month.
NASA claims the astronauts endured only a very brief exposure, passing through the thinnest parts of the belts in a matter of hours. But once they were through, they faced a still more deadly phenomenon.
So here we have these clowns running around in tinfoil craft, stopping solar radiation. And I'm not talking about the light, I'm talking about the radiation from the solar storms.
You put a man in a powerful solar flare, he's dead. End of story. He is dead, unless he carries protection.
These unpredictable eruptions from the sun can knock out satellites and electricity grids on Earth, but they can be detected by an early warning computer system.
When you land on the moon, you're practically standing still, being bombarded with all this solar radiation and smacking into you, which is why they had to hide the whole thing, because it just can't be done. It couldn't be done then, can't be done today, and it sure isn't going to be done in the future when they're planning on this manned mission to Mars.
Just 3 months after the Apollo 16 mission, NASA admitted that a violent solar flare did hit the moon's surface. It was powerful enough to have killed the astronauts.
Solar flares are one of those things that you have to take a calculated risk on, because they will zap you with radiation once they get to you, but you've got a long time, hours if not a day or more, to either come back to Earth, find a shielded place, or prepare yourself.
The astronauts' only potential shield was their spacecraft.
And they had plans for this. The plan was to turn the bulky end of the ship toward the incoming front of radiation. That bulk of the ship and all the fuel in it would provide plenty of protection for that burst of radiation.
The conspiracy theorists believe that radiation is the final nail in the coffin, scientific proof that the astronauts could not have survived a trip to the moon and back. But paradoxically, radiation may also offer proof of the counterclaim, that we've definitely been to the moon and souvenirs brought back may prove it.